Nate Hart had never been a man who liked drawing attention. After his wife passed away 3 years ago, he moved into his late parents' old house at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, hoping the silence would help him rebuild what was left of his life. The home wasn't much. An aging single-story ranch with faded blue siding and a cracked driveway, but it held the kind of memories that steadied him when everything else felt unmoored. What kept him going was his teenage son, Logan, a bright and restless kid who had inherited both his mother's smile and her curiosity about the world. To give them both something to look forward to, Nate bought a used RV from an auction, a bulky, weathered thing with peeling paint and more character than comfort. He imagined fixing it up with Logan, planning road trips, escaping for a while from the weight of grief and the monotonous grind of suburban life. The RV became their project, their symbol of freedom waiting patiently at the end of the driveway. The neighborhood itself had always seemed pleasant enough, the kind of place that marketed tranquility like a brand. Lawns trimmed to uniform perfection, hedges sculpted into precise geometry, and mailboxes painted in HOA-approved beige. The Homeowners Association ruled everything here with quiet tyranny. What color your curtains could be, when you could repaint your fence, how long your trash bins could stay at the curb. Nate kept to himself and stayed compliant for the most part. He didn't attend meetings or engage in the petty gossip that circulated through block parties, but he paid his dues on time and followed the rules as best he could. That was until the RV arrived. Within days of parking it in his driveway, Nate received his first notice. Recreational vehicles must not be stored on residential property beyond 72 hours. The letter was printed in polite yet unmistakably threatening language, signed by the HOA president, Linda May, whose reputation for obsessive enforcement had become a neighborhood legend. Nate read the notice twice, then checked the HOA's official bylaws online. The rule applied only to street-side parking, not private driveways. He wasn't blocking any sidewalks, and the RV was registered, insured, and entirely on his property. So, he ignored it, assuming the letter had been sent in error. But another arrived the following week, this time citing visual disruption and neighborhood aesthetic non-compliance. It was ridiculous, but Nate still tried to stay calm. He emailed Linda, explaining that the RV was parked legally and that it would remain there only while he finished repairing the electrical system. Her reply was curt and almost mocking. "We'll review your case, Mr. Hart. In the meantime, please refrain from any violations that could further compromise community standards." Something about that phrasing stuck with him. Your case. As if he were on trial for owning a piece of personal property on his own land. The tension between them simmered quietly for weeks. HOA members began slowing their cars whenever they passed his house, glancing at the RV with thinly veiled disdain. Logan mentioned that one of his friend's parents had called it an eyesore. Nate shrugged it off, but a seed of unease had already been planted. He decided to install security cameras. Nothing extravagant, just a few discrete units covering the driveway and front yard. He told himself it was for insurance purposes, but deep down he knew it was more than that. He didn't trust how far the HOA might go to make a point. Then came the night that changed everything. It was mid-autumn, the kind of night when the air hung thick and cool, and the street lamps buzzed faintly through the mist. Nate had fallen asleep on the couch after another long shift, the TV humming softly in the background. Sometime past 2 a.m, the house alarm beeped, a quiet motion alert from the security system. Half asleep, he glanced at his phone, expecting maybe a raccoon rummaging near the bins. Instead, the live feed showed headlights cutting across his driveway. His pulse quickened. The grainy image revealed a flatbed tow truck idling in front of his property. 2 men in dark jackets were working fast, looping heavy cables under the RV's front axle. One of them turned toward the camera for a brief second, And in that moment, Nate saw a patch on his vest, white letters against navy fabric. HOA Enforcement. Adrenaline shot through him. He threw on a jacket and stormed outside, barefoot, the cold biting through the concrete. "Hey!" he shouted, voice echoing through the quiet street. The men froze for a moment, then one raised a hand in a lazy, almost dismissive gesture. "Association order," the driver said. "Vehicles not in compliance." Nate's heart was pounding so hard it drowned out the rest of the words. "This is private property," he barked. "You don't touch anything on my land without a warrant." The men exchanged a look, then one muttered something into a handheld radio. Seconds later, they disconnected the cables and climbed back into the truck. As the vehicle rolled away, Nate noticed the RV's bumper had been scraped, the metal bent slightly where the hook had dug in. He stood there in the cold, breathing heavily, watching the truck disappear into the night. The silence that followed was suffocating. Logan appeared at the doorway, bleary-eyed and frightened. "Dad, what was that?" Nate didn't answer right away. He just stared at the damaged RV, the security light flickering weakly above it, and felt a deep, gnawing certainty settle in his chest. This wasn't an accident. Someone had sent them. And whoever it was, they had just declared war. By the following morning, Nate Hart was still running on fumes, the events of the night spinning endlessly in his mind. He hadn't slept at all, his thoughts replaying the flashing tow lights, the glint of metal cables tightening around the RV, the patch that said HOA Enforcement. He had re-watched the footage from his security cameras at least 20 times, pausing and zooming, confirming every detail. It was all there, the timestamp 2:17 a.m., the unmarked tow truck, and the two men methodically preparing to drag his RV away. The video was proof that this hadn't been a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act, coordinated and illegal. He felt the slow, creeping burn of anger replace the exhaustion in his body. When Logan came into the kitchen, still in his pajamas, Nate forced a smile, pretending everything was fine. But his son wasn't fooled. "They were trying to steal it, weren't they?" the boy asked quietly. Nate hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, they were. But they're not going to get away with it." He spent the morning gathering evidence, photos of the scratches on the RV, screenshots of the security footage, and copies of the previous HOA notices. He printed them all, lining them up across the kitchen counter like pieces of a crime board. Around noon, he drove straight to the HOA office, a beige brick building tucked between a dentist's clinic and a pet supply store. The air inside smelled faintly of disinfectant and perfume. At the reception desk, a young woman looked up from her computer with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked in a tone that suggested he wouldn't be getting one. "I need to speak with Linda May," Nate said firmly. "It's about an incident at my property last night." The receptionist typed something half-heartedly, then disappeared through a side door. A few minutes later, Linda emerged, her smile as sharp as the lines of her navy blazer. "Mr. Hart," she said smoothly, as if greeting an old friend. "To what do I owe this visit?" Nate handed her a USB drive. "You might want to watch this before you ask that question." Her expression didn't change as she gestured toward a small meeting room. Inside, the air was cool and sterile. Linda plugged the drive into her laptop, the flicker of the screen reflecting off her glasses as the video began to play. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The faint hum of the laptop fan filled the silence. When the footage ended, Linda closed the lid and folded her hands neatly on the table. "I see," she said. "That's unfortunate." Nate leaned forward, incredulous. "Unfortunate? Someone from your association tried to tow my property at 2 a.m. On private land, without notice." You're calling that unfortunate." Linda's tone didn't waver. "The towing company we use was acting under a standing directive to enforce compliance with community standards. If they acted in error, we'll look into it." Nate stared at her, stunned by the calm indifference in her voice. "They damaged my RV. They trespassed. This isn't a parking ticket, Linda. This is a crime." She tilted her head slightly, her smile cooling into something mechanical. "Mr. Hart, I'd advise you to lower your voice. The association doesn't take kindly to accusations without proof of intent. You said it yourself. There may have been an error." Her words carried the same polished hostility as her emails, that quiet, bureaucratic menace hidden beneath layers of professionalism. "You have all the proof you need," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "If this isn't resolved, I'll be filing a police report and forwarding that video to the local news." For the first time, Linda's smile faltered just slightly before she recovered. "That's your right, of course," she said, standing up. "But be aware that the HOA also has rights. Your property is bound by its covenant, and any violations, intentional or otherwise, can result in penalties. Let's not make this more unpleasant than it needs to be." The implication was clear. She wasn't afraid of him, because she thought the system was on her side. Nate left the office shaking, furious but resolved. He filed the police report that afternoon, though the officer at the front desk looked skeptical when he explained what had happened. "You're saying your HOA hired a tow truck to take your RV?" the man asked, scribbling lazily in his notebook. "At 2 a.m? Nate nodded. "I have the footage." The officer sighed. "We'll take a look, but these HOA disputes usually fall under civil matters, not criminal. Best to talk to an attorney." By evening, the adrenaline had faded, replaced by something colder. Focus. Nate uploaded the video to a cloud drive and sent it to 3 local news outlets with a short statement. Homeowners Association attempts illegal vehicle seizure at 2 a.m. Caught on camera. He didn't expect a response right away, but he needed to. No, the truth was out there, beyond the reach of HOA lawyers. Later that night, he sat with Logan at the dining table. The boy's face was tight with worry. "Are they going to come back?" he asked. Nate hesitated, then said, "Not if I can help it." He didn't add the part about checking the cameras every hour or sleeping with the lights on in the living room. 2 days passed before he got a call from a reporter at the local station. Her tone was sharp, professional. "Mr. Hart, this footage is already circulating online. Did you give anyone else permission to share it?" Nate blinked, startled. "No. Wait, it's online." "Yes, it's been reposted multiple times." "You should probably check social media." When he hung up and opened his laptop, his stomach dropped. The video had gone viral. Millions of views, thousands of comments, some sympathetic, others mocking, but all sharing the same disbelief. Who tries to tow an RV at 2 a.m.? The HOA's reputation was unraveling in real time, and Linda May's name was quickly making its way through angry community forums. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Nate noticed a black SUV idling across the street. Its engine was off, but the tinted windows gave no hint of who was inside. After a few minutes, it drove off without headlights. Later, when he checked the cameras, the SUV had appeared twice more, always around the same time. The next morning, a new envelope appeared in his mailbox. No return address, no HOA logo this time. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line typed neatly across it. "You're making things worse for yourself." Nate stared at it for a long moment, then crumpled it in his fist. He looked toward the driveway where the RV sat silent and scarred and felt something inside him settle. They wanted him afraid, silent, compliant, But they had made a mistake. He wasn't going anywhere. The following week unfolded like a siege conducted in slow motion. Each morning brought something new. A letter, a notice, a warning carefully worded in that bureaucratic tone designed to sound reasonable while tightening the noose around his life. The first was a formal citation from the HOA claiming that the RV violated community guidelines concerning non-conforming exterior storage. Then came another, accusing him of ongoing non-compliance and disruption of neighborhood aesthetics. The full phrasing grew sharper, almost gleefully punitive, as if the association were baiting him into losing his temper. What made it worse was that none of these violations existed in the bylaws. Nate knew that. He had read them cover to cover until his eyes blurred. He had even printed the relevant sections, highlighting every line that proved his innocence. But the truth didn't matter to them. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control. He decided to document everything. Every notice, every conversation, every encounter was logged and dated. He bought a small recorder and began keeping it in his jacket pocket, ready for the next confrontation. It didn't take long. On a gray Tuesday afternoon, as he was cleaning the RV's interior, a white SUV pulled up to the curb. Linda May stepped out, clipboard in hand, her perfume cutting through the scent of damp air and gasoline. "Mr. Hart," she called out, smiling that same corporate smile that never reached her eyes. "We need to discuss your ongoing violations." Nate wiped his hands on a rag, already feeling the tension in his shoulders. "There are no violations," he said evenly. "I've reviewed the bylaws, and my RV is parked entirely within my property line. There's no street obstruction, no hazard, nothing illegal." Linda tisked softly, as though speaking to a child who had failed to understand something simple. "You're forgetting about Section 12.3, visual consistency. The board reserves the right to determine what constitutes a visual disturbance to the community environment. Several residents have filed complaints about your vehicle." Nate clenched his jaw. "Complaints or not, that section doesn't override property rights. You don't get to decide what I park in my own driveway." Her tone turned syrupy, a dangerous sweetness masking the steel beneath. "We all have to make compromises for the greater good, Mr. Hart. The neighborhood depends on unity and respect for shared standards. Surely you wouldn't want to appear uncooperative." He could almost hear the unspoken threat in her voice. Uncooperative people pay for it in ways that rules can't describe. "I'm not removing it," he said flatly. "If you or anyone from your board comes onto my property again, I'll consider it trespassing." For the first time, Linda's smile wavered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. She wrote something on her clipboard and said, "Very well. I'll note your refusal." Then she turned and left, her heels clicking against the pavement like punctuation marks of disdain. That night, Nate uploaded a new batch of footage from his cameras. What he saw made his blood run cold. Around midnight, two figures appeared on the edge of the property line, their silhouettes half swallowed by the darkness. They weren't kids or random trespassers. Their movements were purposeful, deliberate. One held a flashlight, sweeping it across the RV. The other took pictures, the flash blinking in the dark. After a few minutes, they left without saying a word. He watched the clip over and over, feeling that same helpless anger rising again. The next morning, he printed still frames from the video and took them to the police. The officer barely looked at them before saying, "Sir, unless they damaged something or made a direct threat, there's not much we can do. It's private property, but surveillance like that can be tricky to classify." Nate left the station with a hollow feeling in his chest, realizing that the law was a shield the HOA knew how to use better than anyone else. The next escalation came fast. 2 days later, a new notice arrived. not from the HOA, but from the city zoning office. It claimed his RV might be in violation of municipal parking codes and that an inspection had been scheduled. When the city inspector arrived, he looked embarrassed, almost apologetic. "Honestly," he said, scanning the driveway, "I don't even know why I'm here. Everything looks fine. But your homeowners association filed a complaint. Said you were using it as a residence." Nate laughed bitterly. "I sleep in my own house. You can check the meter. There's no power running to it." The inspector sighed and closed his clipboard. "I figured as much. Look, between you and me, they've done this before. They file enough complaints, someone eventually gives in just to make it stop." After the inspector left, Nate sat on the porch for a long time, staring at the RV. It stood there like a stubborn symbol of defiance, a reminder that he still had something of his own the HOA couldn't easily touch. But he also knew that the more they failed to intimidate him, the more desperate they'd become. That evening, he received an email from an unknown address. It contained a single video attachment, grainy footage of his front yard, filmed from an angle none of his cameras covered. The timestamp was from the previous night. Someone had been watching from across the street. There was no message, no signature, just the video. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was surveillance. The following day, he called an attorney. Rachel Lynn, a local lawyer who specialized in property and HOA disputes. Her voice was calm and firm, the kind that made you feel like someone was finally listening. "They crossed the line," she said after hearing his story. "Private towing without authorization is illegal. You've got a solid case for harassment and property damage, maybe even a civil suit. But you'll need to keep gathering evidence. Don't engage with them directly if you can help it." Nate thanked her, though he knew staying disengaged was easier said than done. The HOA had already begun isolating him. Neighbors who once waved now avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when he walked by. The whispering campaign was in full swing, rumors that he was aggressive, unstable, that the RV was some kind of illegal business operation. He could feel the community turning against him, one polite smile at a time. One night, while reviewing his camera feeds, he noticed something else. A white van parked halfway down the block with its lights off. It appeared at almost the same time each night, always leaving just before dawn. The next morning, he walked down the street pretending to take out the trash and found faint tire tracks in the wet pavement where the van had been. Someone was monitoring him. He started sleeping less, waking at every small sound, the tension in his body coiling tighter each day. Logan tried to stay brave, but Nate could see the fear in his son's eyes whenever he heard a car outside after dark. The house no longer felt like a home, it felt like an outpost surrounded by enemies. Then came the final push. The HOA sent him an ultimatum, a formal notice declaring that if he didn't remove the RV within 7 days, the association would exercise its right to remedy the violation through authorized third-party enforcement. The phrase made his skin crawl. He knew exactly what it meant. Another towing attempt, maybe worse. But this time, he was ready. He upgraded the cameras, installed motion lights along the driveway, and kept the footage automatically backed up to cloud storage every hour. When he showed the letter to Rachel, she frowned. That wording is intentionally vague. It's their way of intimidating you into compliance. But if they touch your property again, they'll be in serious legal jeopardy. Nate nodded, gripping the paper so tightly that it crumpled in his hands. The war that started with quiet notices and polite warnings had become something darker. He no longer saw the HOA as a faceless institution. It was a predator, and now it knew he was fighting back. By the end of the second week, Nate Hart realized that this was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was a calculated campaign designed to exhaust him until he either surrendered or broke. The HOA's correspondence had stopped coming by mail and instead began arriving via hand-delivered notices slipped under his door or left on the hood of his truck, unsigned but printed on official letterhead. The language grew colder, more menacing, filled with legal jargon that blurred the line between a warning and a threat. His driveway had become the front line of a psychological siege, and the RV, their supposed eyesore, stood like a defiant monument in the middle of it. Each time Nate thought the tension couldn't escalate further, it did. And yet, in the strangest way, the hostility had begun to sharpen his focus. Where before there had been anxiety and confusion, now there was clarity. They wanted him to make a mistake, to shout, to strike back, to give them the leverage they needed to label him unstable. He refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, he built his case. He organized all the documents and videos, creating a meticulous digital archive. Every notice was photographed, every phone call recorded, every visit time-stamped. He found solace in the precision of it, the small victories of order in the chaos that surrounded him. Rachel, his attorney, guided him through each step. "They're trying to overwhelm you," she said during one of their late-night calls. "But the more reckless they become, the stronger your position gets. Keep documenting everything. We'll use their own aggression against them." Her voice had that quiet steadiness that he had come to depend on, though even she admitted that what the HOA was doing was beyond typical. "I've seen overzealous boards before," she told him, "but this feels coordinated. Someone higher up is pushing for this. Find out who benefits." Nate took her advice literally. He began digging into the HOA structure, uncovering names he'd never noticed before. Members of the enforcement committee who didn't even live on the same street. A towing contract renewed every 6 months under a different company name, and a curious pattern of payments made from HOA funds to a logistics firm that didn't exist in state business records. The deeper he looked, the uglier it became. It wasn't just about power. It was about profit. Linda May and her inner circle were running the association like a small kingdom, funneling money through fake service contracts and covering it up with maintenance expenses. Nate's towing incident wasn't a mistake. It was standard procedure. They had used the HOA's enforcement rights to target homeowners who resisted their authority, then issued fines and penalties that conveniently ended up in the accounts of companies they controlled. One evening, while combing through archived meeting notes, Nate stumbled across a document that made his stomach twist, a proposed amendment drafted 6 months prior that would allow the board to seize non-compliant assets in the event of prolonged violations. It had never been ratified, but the language was disturbingly similar to the notice they had sent him before the attempted tow. It was as if they had already written the playbook for what they did to him. He printed the page and added it to the growing folder marked Evidence. When he showed it to Rachel the next morning, she exhaled sharply. "This is bigger than a lawsuit," she said. "This is fraud and abuse of power. We can take this to the county." For the first time since it all began, Nate felt something like hope flicker through the fatigue. That sense of control, however, didn't last long. 2 nights later, just after midnight, the motion sensors triggered again. Nate, already half awake, grabbed his phone and opened the security feed. What he saw made his hands tremble. A tow truck, different from the first one, was parked in front of his driveway. 2 men stood beside it, talking quietly. They weren't touching the RV, not yet, but they were measuring distances, pointing at the property line, taking photos. Nate didn't rush out this time. Instead, he started recording the live footage and called the police while staying inside. The dispatcher promised to send a patrol unit. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The men finally noticed one of the new floodlights Nate had installed, cursed under their breath, and drove off just before the cruiser arrived. The officer who showed up was polite but distant, offering the same bureaucratic comfort Nate had heard before. If they didn't remove anything, there's not much we can charge them with. Maybe consider parking the vehicle elsewhere just to avoid further issues. Nate stared at him, incredulous. You're telling me to move my own RV because criminals are trying to steal it? The officer's expression didn't change. I'm telling you to keep the peace, sir. The next day, Nate's story hit the local news. One of the outlets that had ignored him earlier finally aired a segment using his footage, presenting it as a growing dispute between a homeowner and an HOA accused of overreach. The video of the midnight tow attempts, paired with his earlier footage, spread rapidly across social media again, sparking outrage from viewers. People began digging into the HOA themselves, uncovering their inflated fees, aggressive enforcement tactics, and a long list of prior complaints buried in county records. For the first time, Linda May was on the defensive. She issued a statement through the HOA's official page, calling the allegations a misunderstanding and accusing Nate of inciting hostility within the community through misinformation. But her carefully curated image was cracking. Residents who had once stayed silent began speaking out. One neighbor, a retired engineer named Peter Klein, came forward to say that his vehicle had been towed under similar circumstances 2 years earlier, and when he protested, the HOA fined him $800 for obstruction of compliance. Another woman revealed that her shed was forcibly removed after the board declared it unsafe, only for the same contractor to bill the HOA 3 times the listed cost. Rachel wasted no time filing formal complaints with both the city and the State Department of Consumer Affairs, attaching all of Nate's recordings and documents. The next 48 hours were a blur of phone calls, statements, and interviews. For the first time, Nate felt like the balance was shifting. But victory came with its own cost. The harassment didn't stop. It changed shape. Anonymous calls began ringing his phone late at night. Silent, breathless pauses followed by clicks. A white powder was scattered across his driveway one morning, which the police later identified as nothing more than flour, but the message was clear. They wanted him rattled. Logan became withdrawn, barely speaking during meals, flinching at every unfamiliar sound. Nate tried to reassure him, but each time he saw his son's tired eyes, he felt the guilt twist deeper. On the 4th night after the news aired, Nate received an email from an address he didn't recognize. The subject line read, "You don't know what you're dealing with." Inside was a single attachment, a short clip, no more than 15 seconds, showing a man in a reflective vest standing near Nate's RV. The footage was from his own security camera, but this angle had never been publicly released. Someone had hacked his system. The realization hit like ice water down his spine. They were inside his home's digital defenses now, watching, waiting. He immediately disconnected the cameras from the network and backed up everything offline, then called Rachel. "They're escalating," she said grimly. "That's intimidation, plain and simple, but they're desperate, Nate. Desperate people make mistakes." The next morning brought confirmation. A city official contacted Rachel, informing her that the towing company contracted by the HOA was under investigation. Their business license had been suspended pending allegations of unlawful vehicle seizure and falsified documentation. Nate listened to the voicemail 3 times, barely daring to believe it. One of the men who had tried to tow his RV, the same face visible in the footage, had been identified as a driver operating without certification. The dominoes were beginning to fall. The system that had felt so untouchable, so monolithic, was starting to fracture. And yet, amid the vindication, there was something else. A darker undertone, a sense that this victory had drawn a target on his back. As he looked out the window at the quiet street, where the morning sun glinted off the side of the RV, he understood that the war with the HOA was no longer about property lines or regulations. It was about who would break first, and he had no intention of being the one to fall. The calm that followed the news of the towing company's suspension was short-lived, like the hush before a storm that already knows exactly where it's going to break. For a few days, the street felt quieter, the air lighter, and Nate almost allowed himself to believe that the worst had passed. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact began greeting him again. One even left a folded note on his porch that simply read, "Good job standing up to them." Yet beneath the surface, the tension had only changed direction. The HOA stopped sending letters, but silence from people like Linda May was never peace. It was strategy. Rachel warned him not to let his guard down. When they lose control of the narrative, she said, they turn personal. Her words proved prophetic. The first sign came on a Wednesday morning when Nate found the RV's side panel keyed from end to end, the white paint slashed open like a wound. It wasn't random vandalism. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing, deep enough to scar the metal, but not enough to break the surface completely. A single piece of paper had been tucked under the windshield wiper, a printed copy of one of the news articles about his case, with a red marker circling his name. No signature, no words, just a circle, drawn like a target. He reported it to the police, but as before, they could do little more than file a report. Could be retaliation, the officer admitted, but without witnesses, it's hard to prove. Nate thanked him, though the hollow routine of law enforcement procedure felt like salt in an open cut. That night, Logan refused to sleep in his own room and asked if they could camp inside the RV instead. Nate agreed, even though the idea of staying inside the very thing that had sparked this chaos felt strangely ironic. The next blow came from a different direction, through paperwork. The HOA filed a civil complaint against Nate for defamation, public harassment, and property value damage. The claim accused him of spreading false information, of fabricating the towing footage, of creating a climate of hostility detrimental to community harmony. The words dripped with hypocrisy, each paragraph more absurd than the last. When Rachel read through the document, her expression hardened. "This isn't about winning," she said. "They're trying to drain you financially, make you spend months fighting them in court until you give up." She was right. The lawsuit wasn't built to succeed. It was built to exhaust. The filing fees alone were staggering, and the hearing dates were set months apart, guaranteeing a slow bleed of time and money. Still, Nate refused to retreat. "If they want a fight," he said, "then they'll get one in the open." Meanwhile, the digital harassment grew worse. Fake social media profiles began posting in local community groups, claiming Nate had doctored his evidence, that he was running an illegal repair business from his home, that he'd threatened HOA staff with violence. The lies spread like mold, fed by the echo chamber of gossip and fear. Some neighbors started filming him when he stepped outside. Others crossed the street when he walked by. The isolation was suffocating, but the humiliation only hardened his resolve. Late one evening, as he sat in the RV sorting through folders of evidence, his computer pinged. A new email notification from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "You should have kept quiet." Attached were photographs taken from inside his fenced backyard. Someone had been there. He felt a chill run through him, that creeping sensation that safety was now a fragile illusion. He forwarded the email to Rachel and called the police again, but even as he spoke to the dispatcher, he could tell from her tone that it would end the same way. Another report, another shrug. 2 days later, the investigation into the towing company deepened. A county official contacted Rachel to request Nate's cooperation in providing his footage for a formal hearing. What they discovered was damning. The towing company hadn't just operated without a valid license. They had forged authorization forms from multiple HOAs across the region, conducting dozens of illegal seizures under the guise of neighborhood enforcement. Nate's case had triggered a domino effect of exposure, and several victims came forward with similar stories. Cars taken from private driveways, RVs seized without notice, fines issued that never reached official HOA accounts. Within a week, the company's owner was arrested on charges of fraud and unlawful property seizure. Local news outlets picked up the story again, this time naming Linda May directly as one of the HOA officials under review for possible complicity. But victory brought new fury. One night around midnight, Nate woke to the sound of footsteps outside. He grabbed his phone and pulled up the camera feed, only to see the front lens filled with static. The signal had been cut. He moved silently to the window and peered out. A dark figure was crouched near the RV's rear bumper, holding something metallic. For a split second, the porch light caught the glint of a wrench before the figure darted away into the shadows. Nate ran outside, shouting, but the street was empty. On the ground behind the RV lay a single bolt and a half-unscrewed lug nut. They had been trying to loosen the wheels, another act of sabotage disguised as mischief. He repaired the damage, replaced the cameras with hardwired backups, and sent the footage fragments to the authorities. When the HOA's next official meeting rolled around, Nate decided to attend for the first time. The community hall was half filled with residents whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward him as he entered. Linda sat at the front table, her expression controlled but tense, a faint tremor in her hand as she shuffled papers. "Mr. Hart," she said through a tight smile, "this meeting is for members in good standing. You are currently under review." Nate ignored her and set a small USB drive on the table. "That's the full uncut footage of both towing attempts," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "and evidence that your board has been using HOA funds to pay companies under investigation. You might want to watch it before pretending this is about aesthetics." The murmurs around the room grew louder. One of the other board members, a man named Charles Boone, stood abruptly, his face pale. "We should take a recess," he muttered, but it was too late. The crowd had turned restless, their polite suburban veneer cracking under the weight of suspicion. By the time Nate left the meeting, he could already sense the shift in the air. The whispers that once condemned him now carried doubt directed toward the board. The following morning, half the HOA committee had resigned, citing ethical disagreements. Linda, however, refused to step down. She issued another statement blaming internal miscommunication and accusing unnamed members of leaking confidential materials. Yet her control was unraveling. The county investigation into the towing scandal expanded to include her personal financial records, and rumors circulated that the HOA's insurance provider had withdrawn coverage pending review of ongoing legal liabilities. Still, the attacks on Nate didn't stop. Someone slashed the tires of his truck. His mailbox was torn from the ground and left in the middle of the street. But by now, fear had burned itself into something colder and steadier, a sense of purpose. He wasn't just defending his own property anymore. He was exposing a system that thrived on intimidation. Rachel prepared the final set of filings for court, adding charges of harassment and emotional distress. "They've lost their leverage," she said. "Now it's just about finishing it." Nate looked through his window at the RV gleaming faintly under the security lights, battered but still standing, and thought of everything it represented. His late wife's dream of travel, his promise to his son, and the stubborn belief that no one should have to fight this hard just to keep what's already theirs. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, the fear had finally changed sides. The day of the court hearing dawned gray and heavy, the kind of morning that seemed to hold its breath. Nate arrived early, dressed in the same charcoal suit he had worn to his wife's funeral, the fabric a little loose now from months of restless nights and skipped meals. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant, a sterile place where truth had to squeeze itself into formal sentences and sworn statements. Rachel met him in the hallway, calm as always, but with that sharp focus in her eyes that told him she was ready for a war. "They'll try to drag this out," she murmured. "Linda's attorney will use every trick he has to deflect, to confuse, to make it seem like this is about petty neighborhood politics. Don't let him. Stick to facts. The video speaks louder than anything." Nate nodded, clutching the flash drive in his pocket, feeling its weight like a weapon he had forged himself through sleepless months of fear and resistance. When the session began, the courtroom was fuller than anyone expected. Reporters lined the back wall, neighbors filled the benches, and even a few members of the HOA board sat together in stiff, uncomfortable silence. Linda May entered last, wearing a tailored gray dress and a practiced expression of dignity wounded by misunderstanding. Her lawyer, a sleek man with polished shoes and an expensive watch, did most of the talking. He began by painting Nate as a disgruntled homeowner who had overreacted to minor code enforcement measures, turning a community disagreement into a spectacle for personal attention. He used words like combative, defamatory, uncooperative. Nate sat still, jaw tight, staring straight ahead while the man spoke as if the months of harassment, the vandalism, the midnight intrusions had been figments of his imagination. When it was Rachel's turn, the tone of the room changed. Her voice was steady, deliberate, each word cutting through the noise like the crack of a gavel. She began, not with emotion, but with evidence. The towing footage, the forged documents, the financial transfers between the HOA and the fake maintenance firms. One by one, she stacked facts until they formed something immovable. The video played on a screen at the front of the courtroom, its grainy black and white images filling the silence. The sound of metal chains clinking against asphalt echoed faintly through the speakers. It was unmistakable. Two men, unmarked truck, 2:17 a.m., the patch labeled HOA enforcement. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Was this operation authorized?" he asked. Linda's lawyer hesitated, then stammered something about contractual miscommunication. Rachel was relentless. "Miscommunication doesn't explain why the same company performed 31 illegal tows in 6 months, or why its owner was arrested for fraud last week." She turned toward Linda. "It doesn't explain why this board continued paying that company after those incidents were reported." Linda's composure cracked for the first time. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, the faint tremor returning. When she tried to speak, her voice wavered. "The board acted in good faith," she said, but it came out weak, defensive. Rachel pressed harder. "Good faith isn't dragging a man's property off his land in the middle of the night. It isn't sending anonymous threats to silence him, and it certainly isn't pocketing community funds under the pretense of enforcement." Every sentence was a nail, and by the time she finished, the room had gone utterly still. The judge called for a recess, but the momentum had already shifted. Nate could feel it, the slow, inevitable turning of something larger than him, like a tide that had finally decided which shore it favored. When court resumed, the judge's verdict was measured but firm. The evidence of misconduct was substantial and credible. The attempted seizure of Nate's RV was deemed illegal, the towing company's actions unlawful, and the HOA's complicity undeniable. The court ordered full restitution for the damage to his property and awarded additional compensation for emotional distress and legal expenses. More importantly, the ruling mandated an external audit of the HOA's finances and temporarily suspended Linda May from her position pending investigation for potential fraud. The gavel came down once, a single sharp sound that felt like the release of months of pressure. For a moment, Nate couldn't move. The courtroom blurred as a wave of relief crashed through him, almost dizzying in its intensity. Rachel touched his shoulder lightly, her smile small but proud. "You did it," she whispered. He looked at Linda then, her face pale, eyes fixed somewhere far away, the illusion of authority finally stripped from her like a mask that had melted in the heat of truth. The other board members avoided her gaze, whispering among themselves, already distancing their names from hers. Outside, cameras waited, microphones flashing questions he couldn't hear. He gave one statement, brief and measured. "This was never just about me. It was about accountability. No one should be above the law, not even a homeowners association." That evening, as he drove home, the streets felt different. Lighter somehow. The same houses, the same hedges, but the oppressive quiet had lifted. When he turned into his driveway, the RV stood waiting, its silver frame gleaming in the late sun like a battered soldier returned from battle. Logan ran out from the porch, grinning for the first time in weeks. "We won?" he asked, breathless. Nate smiled, the exhaustion in his chest finally giving way to something softer. "Yeah," he said quietly, "we won." They stood there together, father and son, watching the sky deepen into gold. For the first time in months, the silence that surrounded them wasn't hostile. It was peace, the real kind, earned through resistance, carved out of fear, and made stronger by the fight it took to claim it. The weeks that followed felt almost unreal to Nate, as if he had stepped out of a long, violent storm into airs, so still he no longer trusted it. The chaos that had ruled his days for months had gone silent. No more letters, no more shadowed cars idling across the street, no more voices whispering behind closed blinds. The HOA's office, once humming with self-importance, stood half empty. Linda May resigned officially before the investigation concluded, her polished nameplate removed from the door and replaced with a handwritten "Under Review" sign taped crookedly to the glass. The new interim board issued a public apology, citing systemic failures in oversight. It was bureaucratic language, hollow and careful, but for Nate, it was enough. Justice wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came quietly, carried in the small satisfaction of watching a system built on intimidation finally collapse under its own weight. Life began to take on shape again. Logan went back to sleeping through the night, his laughter returning to the house like sunlight filtering through a room long shuttered. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid them now stopped by with hesitant smiles and casseroles, the suburban gesture of truce. Some apologized outright, embarrassed by how easily they had believed the lies. Nate accepted their words without bitterness. He had no energy left for grudges. He was simply glad the air no longer felt poisoned. The RV, still bearing the scars of the fight, scratched paint, a dented bumper, remained in the driveway, a quiet symbol of what they had endured. Every time Nate looked at it, he felt a mixture of pride and disbelief that something so ordinary could have become the center of such a war. When the story finally faded from the news cycle, he and Logan decided to take the RV out for their first real trip. They left before dawn one morning, the engine humming steady as they headed west, chasing the horizon. The road stretched open and empty, and for the first time in years, Nate felt no need to look over his shoulder. As the miles rolled beneath them, he realized that what they were leaving behind wasn't just a neighborhood. It was the version of himself that had once believed silence was safety. He had learned that peace wasn't the absence of conflict, but the courage to face it. When Logan fell asleep beside him, the early sun painting the world in gold, Nate allowed himself a rare, unguarded smile. The RV moved forward, steady and sure, carrying them both towards something new. Something unclaimed, a future earned through endurance and the quiet, stubborn insistence on being free.